The first slight of the evening was not the absence of a word, but the absence of a carriage, and Wren Thorne, Duchess of Alderley, felt it exactly as she was meant to. She did not send a servant after him. She did not ask why the second carriage stood empty in the coach house, with its axle unmended for a week that had somehow never found an hour of the Duke's attention. She did not give the assembled staff of Alderley Hall, standing very still in the gravel yard as if the gravel itself had gone quiet, the satisfaction of watching her face do anything at all. Alderley, that autumn of the year the old king's health began its long decline, was a house that had learned to hold its breath before she did, its windows lit gold against a sky already bruising towards storm, its long avenue of lindens shedding leaves that the wind moved like a crowd shifting its weight from foot to foot, waiting to see who would speak first. The house did not love her. It merely tolerated her, the way a well-bred animal tolerates an unfamiliar hand, out of habit rather than affection, and it excluded her in the particular fashion of old stone, by remembering, in every cold corridor and every portrait whose eyes had watched 5 generations of Thorne brides arrive in finer carriages than the one that had just rattled away without her, that she was new and second, and did not by rights belong among them. Convenient, that was the word the countryside had settled on for her, murmured first by an aunt who meant it kindly, and then repeated by everyone else who did not. A convenient match. A convenient arrangement. A convenient duchess, which was, everyone agreed, a very civil way of saying that she had been useful at the precise moment usefulness was required, and had not since given anyone a reason to think of her as anything more. She had not corrected them. Correction was a luxury reserved for women whose birth made their opinions worth defending, and Wren's birth had made her, at best, tolerated, and she had learned young that the surest way to survive a room that resented you was to give it nothing to resent. Before her marriage, before the Duke, before Alderley's cold hallways and colder sister, there had been a smaller house on the edge of a horse county 3 days' ride from London, and a father named Josiah Calder who trained carriage teams for men richer and duller than himself, and who had, in the last winter of his life, pressed into his daughter's hands a pair of driving gloves worn soft and dark at the palm, the leather cracked along the knuckles where his own hands had gripped 1,000 reins in weather no gentleman would have driven through, and had said to her, in the flat, unornamented way he said everything that mattered, that steady hands don't ask to be seen. Wren, they only need to be trusted. She had been 15. She had not understood him then. She had kept the gloves anyway, through her father's death and her aunt's cramped, parsimonious household, and the marriage that had been arranged for her with the brisk efficiency of men discussing a hedge that needed moving, and she had brought them to Alderley in a trunk otherwise full of practical, unfashionable things, and on the single occasion Lady Antonia Thorne had discovered them, laid out on a dressing table beside a pair of pearl-buttoned evening gloves that had cost more than Wren's father had earned in a good year. Her sister-in-law had lifted the worn leather between 2 fingers as though it might be diseased and asked, with the particular warmth she reserved for cruelty, whether the stable hands at Alderley knew one of their own gloves had wandered up into the family wing. The room had laughed, not unkindly, not cruelly enough to be remembered by anyone but Wren, and she had said only that she supposed gloves, like people, were sometimes worth more than they looked, and had taken them back, and had not worn them again in company, though she kept them in the drawer nearest her bed, where her hand found them most nights before sleep the way another woman's hand might find a locket. That was 6 months into the marriage. By the evening the carriage rattled away without her, it had been 2 years, and the gloves had become the only object at Alderley that seemed, in Wren's private and never spoken estimation, to know her name. The invitation that autumn was to the Ashcombe ball, the largest gathering the county produced outside of the London season proper, held at a neighboring estate whose owner, Lord Ashcombe, had spent 3 decades cultivating exactly the kind of glittering, watchful assembly in which reputations were made and unmade over lobster patties and lukewarm champagne. And every family within 30 miles had been repairing gowns and borrowing jewelry for a fortnight in anticipation of it. Julian Thorne, Duke of Alderley, had informed his wife of his own attendance 3 days prior in the clipped, unadorned manner in which he informed her of most things, standing in the doorway of the estate office with a letter in his hand and his eyes already returning to it before he had finished speaking, and had mentioned, as though it were a footnote rather than the entire substance of the conversation, that Lady Cordelia Vane's carriage had suffered some misfortune with its wheel, and that he had offered, since he would be passing her family's gate regardless, to see her conveyed to the ball himself. He had not asked whether his wife required transport. He had not needed to. It was assumed, in the unspoken arithmetic of the household, that the Alderley landau, the only carriage currently in working order, would naturally carry the Duke, and that whoever else required a seat in it would be accommodated according to a hierarchy in which a duchess 2 years into a marriage of convenience ranked, apparently. Below a family friend whose wheel had broken at a fortunate hour. Wren had said that she understood. She had not said that she found it strange the second carriage's axle had gone unmended for a week when Julian's own correspondence to his solicitor had been dispatched by express rider twice in that same period. Strangeness, once voiced, required an answer, and she had learned that some answers cost more than the silence that avoided them. On the evening itself, she stood at the top of the front steps and watched the landau pull away down the long lime avenue with her husband's profile visible for one moment through the glass, turned toward the woman beside him, already speaking, already easy in a way he was rarely easy with his own wife. And Wren did not turn back into the house immediately. She did not lower her head. She did not give the 2 footmen flanking the door, who had gone very careful and very blank in the particular manner of servants pretending not to witness something, the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. She simply stood, one hand resting on the stone balustrade, gone cold with the evening's first true chill, and watched the carriage lamps shrink to 2 amber points and then to nothing at all where the avenue curved beyond the lindens. And only then did she go back inside, not to weep, not to send an outraged note to her aunt, not to do any of the things a woman in a lesser story might have done, but to change out of her afternoon dress into the deep, unfashionable green silk that had been her only truly fine gown since her wedding, and to send, with a composure that cost her considerably more than it appeared to, for the smaller gig and the gelding named Merit that the head groom kept in reasonable condition precisely because the Duchess, unlike anyone else at Alderley, troubled to visit the stables and ask after him. No thunder cracked over the house as she gave the order. No curtain in the hall stirred as though some unseen hand had registered the insult. The evening continued exactly as evenings do. Indifferent, unhurried, entirely unmoved by the fact that somewhere inside it, a woman had just quietly decided something she would not announce to a single living soul. She had driven a carriage team before she had properly learned her letters. Her father had set her on the box beside him at 6 years old, with her small hands folded over his larger ones on the reins, and by 12 she had driven a pair unaccompanied along roads he trusted to no other child, and by 16 there was no one in the county, gentleman or groom, who could fault her hands on a difficult team, though there had been a great many who found it faintly appalling that a lady should have hands at all worth speaking of. That competence had followed her into her marriage the way water follows the lowest ground, unremarked, unrewarded, useful chiefly to other people. It was Wren who had quietly corrected an error of nearly 400 pounds in the Alderley stud accounts 8 months into her marriage, an error the estate's steward had insisted was clerical and had blamed, with impressive smoothness, on the ink having run in a damp ledger. She had said nothing to contradict him, beyond privately keeping her own careful copy from that month forward. In a small marbled notebook she told no one about, because she had learned that being right, for a woman in her position, was rarely rewarded and often resented, and that the wiser course was simply to be right quietly and be ready. No one at Alderley knew that the estate's breeding program, credited entirely to the steward's shrewd eye and the Duke's inherited instinct for good bloodlines, had in fact been quietly steered for 2 years by a series of small, unattributed suggestions in the Duchess's careful hand, appended to correspondence the Duke read and acted upon without ever once asking who had first noticed that a particular mare's temperament suited her better to a gentler stallion than the one originally proposed. That, too, was familiar. She harnessed the gelding herself in the stable yard, waving off the underworked groom who hovered uncertainly at the door of the tack room, because there was a particular satisfaction, private and unwitnessed, in doing competently and alone the thing the world assumed she could not do at all, and she drove out of Alderley's gates a full quarter hour after the landau had vanished down the same road. Her father's old gloves, retrieved from the drawer beside her bed for the first time in company since the day Antonia had mocked them, drawn snug over hands that did not shake though the temperature had dropped, and the sky to the west had gone the deep bruised color that meant weather was coming, whether the county's finest cared to notice it over their champagne or not. It is a curious fact of society, and one worth pausing over, that a woman is only ever praised for her composure after she has already been denied every reason to keep it. Grace under provocation is admired chiefly by the people who provided the provocation. The road to Ashcombe ran along the river for the first 2 miles, and then climbed through beech woods gone copper and gold in the fading light. And Wren, alone on the box with the reins settled easy and sure in her father's gloves, found the ordinary rhythm of driving, the small, constant corrections of hand and voice that kept a good horse honest on an uncertain road. Settling something in her chest that 2 years of pleasant, careful, unloved marriage had left permanently unsettled. She passed, at the 2nd mile, the landau itself, stopped at an angle in the road, with one wheel canted into a rut where the recent rain had softened the shoulder. Her husband standing in the last gray light with his coat already dusted at the knee from inspecting the axle, and Lady Cordelia Vane seated still and elegantly displeased inside, and Wren did not slow. She did not call out an offer of help that would have been, in the moment, both genuinely kind and quietly unbearable to receive. She lifted one gloved hand in a small, unhurried acknowledgement, the kind one gives a neighbor passed on an ordinary errand, and drove on. And if her husband's head turned to follow the gig longer than the courtesy strictly required, she did not allow herself to notice it. Because noticing required hope, and hope, in Wren's careful accounting of her own heart, was a debt she had stopped extending credit against some time ago. She arrived at Ashcombe a full 40 minutes before the first of the county's finer carriages began rolling up the drive, her gown only lightly dusted from the road, her color high from the cold and the effort, and not, whatever anyone chose to assume later, from any indignity, and Lord Ashcombe himself, coming out to greet what he had assumed would be an early arriving neighbor. Found instead the Duchess of Alderley climbing down from a modest gig unassisted, having driven herself, alone, the full 7 miles from her own gate, and he was, for one unguarded moment, too surprised to remember his manners. She had walked into the ballroom on her own arm, which is to say on no arm at all, greeting her hostess with an ease that cost her nothing to perform, because performing ease had become, over 2 years, very close to her natural resting expression, and the first ripples of the evening's gossip had begun before the second course of arrivals had even handed over their cloaks. A duchess, arriving without her duke. A duchess, arriving having driven herself, like a farmer's wife come to market, someone murmured, and someone else, more precisely cruel, wondered aloud whether Alderley kept his wife so short of funds that a hired driver was beyond the family's means, the words pitched to carry exactly as far as they were meant to, and not a foot further. Solicitous concern dressed in its Sunday coat, is everything quite all right? One hears such things about a house with only one working carriage. The words sounded like sympathy. The pressure folded inside them was not sympathy at all, and Wren, who had spent 2 years learning to hear the difference, answered only that merit was a reliable gelding and the evening fine for driving. Which was true. Humble and entirely beside the point the speaker had intended to make, and which left the speaker with nothing to do but laugh, not quite as freely as she had hoped, and move on. It was Lady Cordelia Vane who arrived next, some 3/4 of an hour later, delivered at last by the Duke's landau, with its wheel reset and its axle presumably now, miraculously, sound. And it was Lady Cordelia who found the small crowd of arrivals already murmuring about the Duchess, who had beaten her own husband's carriage to the ball, and who absorbed this information with the particular grace of a woman recalculating her advantage in real time, arranging her face into something warm, before she crossed the floor to take both of Wren's hands in her own gloved ones and declare, for the benefit of everyone within earshot, how resourceful dear Wren always was, how very useful it must be to have grown up somewhere so refreshingly practical, the compliment cut so precisely to the shape of the insult beneath it that half the room heard admiration, and the other half heard exactly what was meant. It was not a question, though it was phrased as one. When Cordelia asked whether Wren had enjoyed the drive, it was an invitation to explain herself, and Wren declined it, exactly as it had been designed to require, by agreeing pleasantly that she had, and adding that she supposed not everyone was taught to enjoy such things, a reply humble enough to survive scrutiny, and precise enough to relocate the evening's small failure of manners onto the woman who had ridden in comfort while another woman drove herself through gathering weather, and Cordelia's smile did not so much falter as recalibrate, the way a market recalibrates after a piece of unwelcome news, and she moved off toward the punch table with the particular briskness of someone who has decided a subject is closed before she has entirely won it. Every society produces its own arithmetic for who is permitted to be clever and who is merely permitted to be quiet, and Cordelia Vane, blessed with beauty, a fortune that needed no explaining, and a family whose name required no defending, had spent her whole life being rewarded for wit that would have been called insolence in anyone lower. And it was this arithmetic, more than any particular malice in her heart, that Wren had learned to navigate rather than resent. The Duke arrived a full hour after his wife, his coat still faintly marked at the knee, his expression carrying the particular flatness he wore in company, the stillness that the county had long ago decided meant coldness, and that Wren, alone perhaps in all of Ashcombe's crowded rooms, had begun to suspect meant something closer to the opposite, a man keeping a great deal very carefully behind a very quiet door. Julian Thorne, Duke of Alderley, was not a man given to visible feeling. His voice, when he spoke, rarely rose, and had never in 2 years of marriage needed to. A quiet word from Julian carried further in a crowded room than another man's shout. Not because anyone feared him exactly, though a great many did, but because he had cultivated, deliberately or not, the particular authority of a man who never wasted breath on anything he did not mean. He crossed the ballroom toward his wife with the unhurried gait of a man who assumed, correctly, that the room would part for him, and stopped before her with a small, formal incline of the head that would have satisfied any observer as ordinary courtesy between a married couple reunited at a ball, and asked in the low, even voice that never needed to rise whether she had found the roads difficult. She said that Merritt had been sensible about the ruts, which was true and which answered nothing at all that he had actually asked, and for a moment, brief enough that Wren herself was not entirely certain afterward that she had not invented it, something moved behind his eyes that was not quite the flat, unreadable calm he wore for the rest of the county. Something closer to the look a man gives an account that will not balance, a fact that refuses to sit where he has filed it. He did not apologize. Dukes, in Wren's admittedly limited experience of them, rarely did, and Julian least of all. Apology required an admission that something had gone wrong, and Julian Thorne had built his entire adult character on the premise that very little in his own carefully managed life was permitted to go wrong. But he did not leave her side again for the better part of an hour, a fact that several of the room's sharper observers noted with the particular interest reserved for departures from an established pattern. And when Lady Antonia, arriving fashionably late in a gown, the exact deep crimson of the family's formal livery, remarked within Wren's hearing that it was fortunate dear Wren had proven so admirably self-sufficient, since one certainly could not expect every bride to arrange her own transport quite so ably. Julian's reply, delivered without any particular heat, was that he was aware of exactly how the evening's arrangements had been managed, and did not require his sister's summary of them. It was not a large rebuke. It would not have registered at all to anyone who had not spent 2 years learning to read every syllable Julian Thorne permitted himself in public. But Antonia's mouth tightened by a fraction most of the room would never have caught, and Wren caught it, and filed it away in the same private ledger where she kept the £400 and the mare's temperament and every other small unrewarded proof that she was, in fact, being watched more closely than anyone at Alderley had ever troubled to admit. That was the first notice, though neither of them would have named it so, and it is a peculiarity of attention paid by the powerful that it very often looks, at first, exactly like nothing at all. The ball continued around them with the particular indifference of large gatherings, indifferent to small domestic wounds the way weather is indifferent to the crops it ruins, the orchestra sawing gamely through a country dance, the punch bowl steadily emptying, Lord Ashcombe working the room with the practiced warmth of a man who had built his reputation on exactly this kind of evening, and if a single duchess had arrived alone in a hired gig while her husband delivered another. Woman in far greater comfort, the world had already, within the hour, moved its attention on to the next small scandal, a torn hem, a broken engagement rumored and denied, a gentleman observed drinking rather more than was wise. No one remarked further on it. No one apologized. The evening simply resumed, exactly as evenings do, and Wren danced twice, once with an elderly baronet who complimented her driving with the genuine enthusiasm of a man who had once kept his own excellent teams and missed them, and once, unexpectedly, with her own husband, who requested the dance in the same flat, unremarkable tone he used to request a report on the stud accounts, and who said almost nothing to her for the whole of it, beyond one observation. Offered as they turned at the top of the set, that Merritt had a good mouth for a gelding his age, and that whoever had trained him had done careful work. She said that her father had trained him 4 years before his death, and that he had always said a good mouth on a horse was 90 parts patience and 10 parts hands. Julian was quiet for the length of the next turn. Then, he said, in a voice pitched low enough that only she could hear it over the orchestra, that patience seemed to run short in most households he knew, and Wren, who had spent 2 years cataloging every crumb of Julian Thorne's attention, the way a starving woman catalogues the contents of a larder she is forbidden to open, said only that she supposed it depended on what the household considered worth being patient for. He did not answer that. His hand, at her waist, did not tighten, but she felt, or believed she felt, some small adjustment in it, the kind of correction a rider makes to a horse that has just done something unexpected and not unwelcome, and then the dance ended. And he returned her to the edge of the room with a bow exactly as formal as the one he had given at the start of the evening, and did not seek her out again before the carriages were called. It would have been easy, and it would have been wrong, to call this the beginning of anything so large as love. Wren did not call it that. Not even privately, not even in the small marbled notebook where she kept her careful accounts of what was true and what merely wished to be. She called it, if she called it anything, a discrepancy, the kind her father had taught her to notice in a ledger long before she understood what it meant to notice one in a man, a figure that did not sit where it was supposed to sit. And she resolved, with the same quiet discipline she brought to every other unbalanced account in her life, to watch it rather than trust it, because trust, in Wren's experience, was expensive, and she had already spent 2 years learning the precise cost of extending it too soon. The drive home that night she took again herself, though Julian, to the visible astonishment of the ostler and the considerably less visible astonishment of his own sister, chose to ride beside the gig on horseback rather than take the repaired landau alone, saying only that the night air suited him, and the two of them traveled the 7 miles back to Alderley in a silence that was not, for the first time in 2 years, entirely uncomfortable. Broken only once, near the 2nd mile where the road climbed through the beech woods, by Julian's low observation that she handled a nervous horse better in the dark than most men handled one in daylight, offered not as flattery, which she would have distrusted, but as the flat, unembellished acknowledgement of a simple fact. The same tone he might have used to note that a fence wanted mending, or a field lay fallow. She said thank you, because there was nothing else honest to say, and did not tell him that she had heard, in the particular flatness of his voice, something she had not heard from him before. Not warmth exactly, not yet, but the beginning of a man revising a figure he had long ago entered into his own ledger without checking it. And revision, she thought, watching the dark shapes of the beeches slide past overhead, was not nothing. It was not admiration. Not yet. But it was, unmistakably, the first stirring of something that had not been there before, and Wren, driving her own gelding home through a countryside gone silver with a rising moon, did not allow herself to hope, because hope was a debt she had learned, at great cost, to stop extending on credit, but she permitted herself, for the length of that dark and quiet road, something smaller and more disciplined than hope, which was simply the private, unspoken decision to keep watching and to keep being, whatever else the world called her, entirely and stubbornly herself. In the weeks that followed, the county talked, as counties do, and the talk settled, as it usually did where Wren was concerned, into a shape more flattering to her husband's dignity than to any accurate account of the evening. It became, in the retelling over tea trays and card tables, a charming eccentricity of the new Duchess, her farm-bred practicality, rather than any admission that the Duke of Alderley had left his own wife without transport to a ball while conveying another woman in comfort, and Wren let the story settle where it would, because correcting it would have required explaining a wound she had already decided not to display. Lady Antonia, for her part, did not let the matter rest quite so easily, and found occasion, some 4 days after the ball, to remark over breakfast that it was a mercy Wren's constitution ran to the hearty sort, given how very often she seemed called upon to manage for herself, a compliment so carefully constructed that it took Wren a full second to locate the blade folded inside it. And she answered only that she had always found managing preferable to waiting, a reply mild enough to pass as agreement and precise enough that Antonia's cup paused a moment too long on its way to her lips before she changed the subject to the weather. It was Aunt Prudence, arriving for a fortnight's visit not 2 weeks later, with her usual mixture of genuine affection and quiet, relentless need, who supplied the season's first real test of Wren's patience, settling into the best guest room with the easy proprietary comfort of a woman who had, after all, arranged this marriage and considered herself owed some dividend from it, and remarking, within her first hour under Alderley's roof, how becoming marriage had made her niece, how well duchesses seemed to eat, before moving, with the practiced smoothness of long habit, into the matter of her own roof, which wanted mending, and her own coach horse, gone lame, and a small sum that would, she was quite certain, resolve both difficulties handily, and which she was equally certain dear Wren, now so comfortably placed, would not begrudge a woman who had, after all, raised her from the age of 11. Wren gave her the money. She always did. Refusal cost more in her aunt's wounded silences and pointed sighs than the sum itself ever cost in coin, and it was easier, had always been easier, to be generous and quiet than to be right and endure the argument that rightness invited. It was this quiet generosity, unremarked and unrewarded outside the ledger Wren kept in her own head, that would return, before the year was finished, to nearly ruin her, though on the ordinary autumn morning she counted out the coins into her aunt's plump, satisfied hand. She had no way of knowing that a woman elsewhere in the county, watching the same small transactions with far less charitable intent, had already begun to wonder how a duchess of modest birth managed to be so consistently, so suspiciously generous with sums no one had troubled to trace. That woman was not Antonia, whose cruelties ran to the domestic and the immediate, but Cordelia Vane, who had spent the weeks since the Ashcombe ball nursing a grievance considerably larger than a delayed carriage, watching with a beauty's practiced attentiveness as Julian Thorne, who had shown her, over the 2 years of Wren's marriage, precisely the same amiable, distant courtesy he showed every woman of his acquaintance, had begun, in small and easily deniable ways, to seek his own wife's company rather more than strict domestic duty required. A query about a mare's bloodline routed through Wren rather than the steward, a second dance requested at a subsequent assembly that etiquette had not strictly demanded, a habit, newly acquired, of remaining in the estate office of an evening rather than joining whatever card party his sister had arranged, on the stated grounds that the accounts wanted his attention, though Antonia, watching her brother's lamp burn late through a window that opened onto the same corridor as the Duchess's private sitting room, had begun to form her own private theory about precisely what those accounts consisted of. It is one of the quieter injustices of the world that a woman's growing worth in the eyes of one person is so often read, by everyone else observing it, not as a reason for warmth, but as a reason for suspicion, and Wren, entirely unaware that she had become, in the space of a single autumn, an object of both her husband's slow and unacknowledged interest, and her sister-in-law's and her rival's mounting alarm, continued to do what she had always done, which was to manage the household's small crises without credit, to correct the steward's figures without announcement, to visit the stables in the gray hour before breakfast, when no one troubled to look for her there, and to keep her father's gloves in the drawer beside her bed, worn soft now in a new place along the thumb, where her own hand had begun, these past weeks, to hold them rather more often than before. She did not yet understand that she had been noticed. She understood only that something in the house had shifted by a matter of a few degrees, the way a room shifts when a window long painted shut is finally, quietly, forced an inch open, not enough to let in a draft anyone else would remark upon, but enough that the air inside had unmistakably begun to move. The shift persisted through the turning weeks of that autumn. Small and steady as a tide no one else in the house seemed to notice was rising, and it was Captain Simon Rain, arriving at Alderley in late October, for what he cheerfully called a fortnight of imposing on Julian Seller, who first said aloud what Wren had spent 2 months carefully declining to name, even in the privacy of her own thoughts. Simon had known Julian since they were boys sharing a tutor neither of them respected, had served beside him in a war that had left Julian quieter than he had been before it, and Simon, by his own cheerful admission, considerably less careful than he ought to have become, and he arrived at Alderley with the particular license of an old friend who had long ago earned the right to say true things at inconvenient moments. He found Wren in the stable yard on his second morning, inspecting a yearling's near foreleg with the unhurried thoroughness of someone who trusted her own hands more than the groom's report, and he leaned against the paddock rail and watched her for a full minute before observing, in the mild tone of a man remarking on the weather, that he had known Julian Thorne for 24 years and had never once, in all that time, seen him rearrange his morning to walk past a stable he had no business in, twice on the excuse of air. Wren said that the Duke took a healthy interest in his horses. Simon said that the Duke took a healthy interest in exactly one horse's rider, and that the horse in question seemed remarkably unbothered by the extra attention, and when Wren did not answer that at all, only bent again to the yearling's leg, with rather more concentration than the leg required, Simon laughed, not unkindly, and said that he had not meant to embarrass her, only to observe that some men communicated affection in the same language they communicated everything else, which was to say sparingly, and that a woman who wished to be courted in poetry had married the wrong sort of duke, but a woman who wished to be trusted with the things that mattered most to a careful man had, whether she credited it yet or not, already succeeded rather thoroughly. He did not wait for her to compose a reply. He touched his hat, remarked that he understood the cellar wanted attending to before noon, and left her standing in the cold, bright yard with a truth she could not immediately rebut, and did not, for several minutes, attempt to. It was not admiration, she told herself later, folding her father's gloves back into their drawer with hands that were not quite as steady as she would have liked. Not yet. But she had begun, these past weeks, to notice things she would once have dismissed as coincidence, the way Julian's questions about the estate had migrated, by careful and unremarked degrees, from the steward's office to her own sitting room, the way he had taken, of an evening, to reading in the small parlor she preferred rather than his own library, offering no explanation beyond a remark about the fire drawing better there, the way his silences beside her had stopped feeling like the silence of a man enduring an obligation and started feeling unmistakably like the silence of a man choosing to stay. Their conversations had begun, too, to acquire an edge that was not quite argument and not quite courtship, a kind of sparring that Wren recognized, with some private astonishment, as the first language she and Julian had ever spoken that felt entirely equal. He asked her opinion of a stallion he was considering for purchase, a showy gray with an impressive record and a reputation, among those who actually rode him, for unpredictable temper, and when she said, carefully, that she thought his blood better suited to breeding than to riding, and that any man who bought him expecting an easy mount would be disappointed within a season. Julian had studied her for a long moment, with the flat, unreadable look the county mistook for coldness, and had then said that it was refreshing to receive an honest answer instead of a flattering one, since most people in his life had learned that agreeing with him was considerably safer than correcting him. She had said that she supposed it depended on whether a man wished to be agreed with or wished to be right, and something had moved at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, the ghost of one, there and withdrawn before she could be certain she had seen it at all. It was in just such a moment, some 3 weeks into that quiet accumulation of small, unspoken things, that Lady Cordelia Vane arrived unannounced for what she described as a neighborly call, and what Wren understood within the first 5 minutes to be reconnaissance. Cordelia found the Duke and Duchess together in the estate office, heads bent over the same ledger, Julian's finger tracing a column of figures while Wren corrected a sum he had transposed, and she stood in the doorway a moment longer than courtesy required before announcing herself, long enough to see something in the easy, unguarded way the two of them occupied the same small space that no reassurance afterward could entirely dispel. She was, whatever else might be said of her, not a foolish woman. And she read the room correctly, and her smile, when she finally stepped inside, cost her rather more than it would have 3 months earlier. She admired, at some length, how thoroughly Wren had made herself indispensable to the estate's daily business, a compliment aimed with practiced precision at the exact spot where the word convenient had always done its quiet work, and added, turning to Julian with the easy familiarity of long acquaintance, that it must be such a relief to have a wife so willing to do a steward's work without a steward's wages, sparing him the expense of a proper clerk. It was not a question, though it wore one's clothing, and the room absorbed it the way a struck bell absorbs a blow, a silence just long enough to be felt. Wren said only that she found the work interesting, which was true, and humble, and left Cordelia with nothing further to press against, and it was Julian who answered, in the low voice that never needed to rise, that he had found his wife's judgment considerably more reliable than any clerk's he had previously employed, and that he did not consider it an economy, but a fortune, a reply so evenly delivered that it took Cordelia a visible half-second to locate its edge, and by the time she had located it, the moment for a graceful retreat had already closed around her. She did not stay long after that. She left with the particular brightness of a woman recalculating a campaign whose early skirmishes had not gone as planned, and Wren, watching her go from the office window, felt something she did not immediately recognize as satisfaction, because satisfaction, too, was a debt she had learned to be careful about extending to herself. It was that same week that the Dowager Duchess Augusta Thorne arrived at Alderley for her customary autumn visit, a small, upright woman of some 70 years whose sharp eyes missed considerably less than her slow, deliberate gait suggested, and whose tongue, blunted by neither age nor rank, had terrified 3 decades of Alderley's household staff and at least 2 prime ministers of Wren's personal acquaintance by reputation alone. Augusta arrived, as she always did, with opinions fully formed and no patience for having them contradicted, and within an hour of her arrival she had installed herself in the best chair of the smaller parlor. Accepted tea she pronounced adequate rather than good, and turned her attention with unnerving directness upon her grandson's wife, whom she had met perhaps a dozen times in 2 years, and had on every occasion treated with a warmth that startled Wren precisely because it asked for nothing in return. Augusta had been, by all accounts, a formidable young duchess herself once, married into a family every bit as cold as the Thornes, and considerably less inclined to thaw, and she regarded Wren now with the particular sympathy of a woman who recognized, in another's careful composure, the shape of a battle she herself had once fought and largely won. She asked, without preamble, whether Wren was happy, a question so bluntly put that Ren, who had spent 2 years deflecting gentler versions of it with practiced ease, found herself for a moment entirely without a ready answer, and Augusta, watching the hesitation, said that she would take the silence as an honest answer rather than press for a false one, and added, stirring her tea with brisk, unsentimental strokes, that in her considerable experience a marriage arranged for practical reasons was no worse a foundation for love than one arranged for romantic ones, and considerably more honest, since at least the parties involved had not deceived themselves about what they were building on. She said it as settled fact, the way she said most things, and moved on before Ren could decide whether to be comforted or alarmed by how precisely the old woman had read her, and it was this same bluntness, deployed a fortnight later under circumstances considerably graver, that would prove the difference between Ren's ruin and her rescue. The trouble arrived, as trouble in well-ordered households so often does, disguised as an ordinary morning. It was the second week of November, the fields gone the color of old iron, and the first hard frosts silvering the paddocks before dawn, when Julian's man of business in London forwarded, under a covering note of evident distress, a letter that had reached the office of Lord Pelham, Julian's late father's oldest friend and the trustee still nominally overseeing the marriage settlement that had joined Wren's modest but real inheritance of grazing land to the Alderley estate. The letter was unsigned. It alleged, in a hand disguised well enough to defeat casual scrutiny, but not, as it would transpire, expert scrutiny, that the Duchess of Alderley had for some months been quietly disposing of prime stock from the estate's breeding stables without her husband's knowledge or consent, selling at least 2 valuable stallions through private arrangement, and diverting the proceeds to relatives of modest means, a practice the letter characterized, with an ugly precision that made Wren's stomach turn cold when Julian finally showed her the page, as systematic and deliberate fraud upon the estate she had married into. It named names. It named Meridian, the gray stallion Julian had purchased that autumn on Wren's own careful advice, and it named a lesser stud colt called Comet, and it cited dates. And it cited, with a specificity that lent the whole document a chilling plausibility, the exact sum Wren had given her Aunt Prudence not 2 months before for the mending of a roof and the purchase of a sound coach horse. Lord Pelham, a careful and not unkind man, but a trustee bound by the settlement's own terms, wrote that he could not in conscience ignore so detailed an accusation, however painful, and that the terms of the marriage contract permitted him, in cases of demonstrated financial impropriety by either party, to petition for a formal review of the settlement's conditions, a review that could, depending on its findings, strip Wren of any independent authority over the very lands that had brought her into this marriage in the first place, and cast sufficient public doubt upon her conduct to make her position at Alderley, whatever Julian's private feelings, functionally untenable. It was no longer, Wren understood within the first cold minute of reading the letter over her husband's shoulder, a matter of a delayed carriage or a barbed compliment at a ball. It was her name, her standing, and very possibly her marriage itself, weighed now against a document detailed enough that half the county, reading only a summary of its claims, would find it entirely credible. Julian's face, when she looked up from the page, had gone the particular still white of a man holding something very large very carefully, and his voice, when he spoke, had none of its usual flatness, though it did not rise either, pitched instead low and urgent in a register she had not heard from him before. He asked her, directly, whether any part of it was true. It was. Of every question he might have asked her in 2 years of marriage, the one that cost her the most to hear, not because she feared the answer, but because she understood, in the half-second before she gave it, that his asking it at all meant he had not yet decided, in his own private ledger, whether her word alone would be sufficient proof. She said that Meridian stood in the north paddock not 40 yards from where they were speaking, and had never in his life been sold to anyone, that Comet had died of a colic the previous spring and had been buried, at Julian's own order, in the ground behind the old orchard, and that the money she had given her aunt had been her own pin money, saved and given openly, nothing hidden, nothing sold. Nothing stolen from the estate that had never asked her opinion of its finances in the first place, except when it suited someone to credit her with them. Julian was silent for a long moment, and it was in that silence, more than in anything he said afterward, that Wren felt the true weight of what had been done to her, because she understood that even a man who wished to believe her, and she thought, watching his face, that Julian did wish it, however carefully he guarded the wishing, required something more than her word to set against a document this precisely constructed. And that requirement, however reasonable in the abstract, felt in the particular like one more small proof that her worth in this house remained forever conditional, forever subject to review, forever, in the end, convenient rather than assured. It was not, she told herself later, alone in her sitting room with her father's gloves pressed between her hands, an unreasonable thing for a man to want proof before he risked his family's name on a woman's unsupported word. It was only unbearable, and the two things, she had learned, were very often the same. Antonia, when the matter inevitably reached her ears, received it with an expression that managed to convey both scandalized propriety and a satisfaction she did not trouble very hard to disguise, remarking to her brother, within Wren's hearing, that she had said from the very beginning that a girl raised in trade and Horsecoper's company could hardly be expected to understand what was and was not properly hers to give away, a line delivered with the particular warmth Antonia reserved for cruelty dressed as concern. Is it not a mercy this came to light before matters went further, and Wren, standing very straight in the doorway with her hands folded in front of her, said only that she was grateful the matter would now be examined properly. Since a false accusation withstood scrutiny considerably better than a true one, a reply mild enough to pass as agreement, and precise enough that Antonia's satisfaction faltered by a fraction before she recovered it. It was Augusta, arriving in the drawing room not an hour after the letter's contents had become common knowledge among the household, who did what no one else in that cold house had yet troubled to do, which was to believe Wren entirely and immediately, without requiring a single fact in evidence. She had known, she announced, planting herself in the best chair with the finality of a woman settling a legal argument, 3 duchesses in her lifetime, accused of scheming by relations who resented them. And in every case, the accusation had said considerably more about the accuser's character than the accused's, and she would stake her own considerable reputation. Thank you. That this niece of Josiah Calder's, a man Augusta recalled meeting once, decades before, and had found scrupulously honest in a horse trade where honesty was rare, had not suddenly discovered a talent for fraud at the advanced age of 24. She did not wait for anyone to contradict her. She turned instead to practical matters with the brisk efficiency of a general assessing a battlefield, demanding to know who precisely had access to the estate's breeding records, who kept the stud book, and whether anyone beside the family had reason to wish the Duchess removed from her present position of quiet trust. And it was this last question, posed over the following days with the same relentless directness Augusta brought to everything, that began slowly to unravel the letter's careful construction. The estate's steward, a soft-spoken, capable-seeming man named Mr. Reeve, who had served the Thorne family for 11 years and whom Julian had never once had cause to doubt, grew, under Augusta's pointed and repeated questioning about the studbook's recent entries, visibly less soft-spoken and considerably less capable seeming. And it was Wren herself, returning to her own small marbled notebook. The private ledger she had kept faithfully since discovering the 400-pound discrepancy nearly 2 years before, who found the anomaly that would unmake the whole edifice of the accusation in a single afternoon. The forged letter dated the sale of Meridian to the 14th of September, a Tuesday, and cited a buyer's name, a Mr. Aldous Fenn of Reading, who had supposedly taken delivery of the stallion that same week. Wren's own notebook, kept faithfully every evening for 2 years out of the same careful habit her father had taught her, recorded that on the 13th and 14th of September she and Julian had been 30 miles distant at his cousin's wedding in Hertfordshire. Meridian himself stabled at Alderley under the daily care of 2 grooms whose names she could produce and whose testimony, given separately, agreed to the day. And that Comet, the second horse the letter claimed sold, had in fact died the previous April, a fact recorded not only in her own notebook, but in the estate's own veterinary accounts the forger, in his haste, had apparently never troubled to check against the studbook he had so carefully falsified. It was Augusta who delivered the discovery to Lord Pelham's own investigating clerk, with the particular relish of a woman who had waited her whole considerable life for precisely this kind of vindication, laying the veterinary account and the wedding invitation and the 2 grooms' sworn statements upon the table in careful sequence. And it was Augusta who said, when the clerk finally conceded the dates could not be reconciled, that there it was, precisely as she had expected, a lie built cleverly enough to survive a glance, and not cleverly enough to survive an afternoon's honest arithmetic, and that whoever had constructed it had made the oldest mistake a forger could make, assuming that no one in this family kept better records than their own greed required. The unraveling, once begun, moved with the particular speed of collapsing things. Mr. Reeve, confronted first by Julian alone, and then, considerably less comfortably, by Julian in the presence of his grandmother and a visibly grim Lord Pelham himself, summoned in person once the anomaly became too significant to settle by post, maintained his innocence for the better part of an hour before the accumulated weight of the veterinary accounts and the groom's statements, and, finally, a hastily produced sample of his own handwriting set beside the letter's careful disguise broke him entirely, and he confessed in a low, shamed voice to having falsified the studbook entries himself over the better part of a year, skimming small sums from breeding fees he had never properly recorded, and to having composed the anonymous letter in a panic when he understood that the Duchess's own meticulous private accounting, a habit he had always privately resented as an intrusion into what he considered his rightful domain, was about to expose discrepancies he could not otherwise explain, and that Lady Cordelia Vane, informed by a housemaid in her family's employ of certain irregularities Reeve had let slip while in his cups, had approached him separately with an offer of discretion in exchange for information that might, as she put it, prove useful in reminding a certain gentleman where his true interests lay. Cordelia's own role, when it emerged, was rather more carefully hedged than Reeve's outright fraud. No letter in her hand, no forgery she could be directly charged with, only a whispered suggestion here, a convenient introduction there. A woman who had, by her own later account to Julian, delivered in a private interview from which Wren was carefully and deliberately excluded, merely wished to see certain truths brought to light, and could hardly be blamed if a frightened man had chosen an unwise method of bringing them, a defense so smoothly constructed that even Augusta, no admirer of Cordelia's, conceded there was likely no charge that could be made to stick, though the county's opinion of Lady Cordelia Vane. Once the fuller shape of the matter became known through the particular alchemy by which servants' knowledge becomes drawing-room certainty within a fortnight, cooled by a degree that no amount of beauty or fortune would fully thaw again that season. Reeve was dismissed without a character and without prosecution, a mercy Julian extended with visible reluctance and only, he said, because a public trial would drag his wife's name through exactly the mud the letter had already tried to bury her in, and the stolen sums, once properly totaled from 2 years of careful falsification, came to considerably more than £400, though Wren, hearing the final figure, felt no satisfaction in having been right so long before anyone troubled to check. Only a tired, hollow relief that the thing was over and a colder, more lasting understanding of exactly how narrowly it had come to costing her everything. It was in the days immediately following the exoneration, once Lord Pelham had departed with profuse apology, and Augusta had extracted from her grandson a promise to institute proper independent accounts going forward, that the true reckoning of the matter settled over Alderley, quieter than the accusation itself, but in some ways heavier, because it was no longer possible for either Julian or Wren to pretend that the danger had been merely social, merely a matter of gossip weathered and survived. Julian had asked her in the first raw minute of the letter's arrival whether any part of it was true. And though he had believed her within the hour, though he had fought for her afterward with a fierceness that surprised even Augusta, the fact of the asking sat between them now, unspoken but present, a discrepancy neither of them had yet found the courage to reconcile aloud. Wren found him, some 4 evenings after Reeve's confession, alone in the estate office long past the hour he usually kept there, the ledgers closed before him, untouched, his hands resting flat on the desk in the particular stillness of a man not working, but merely sitting with something he did not know how to put down. And when she asked whether he required anything, he was quiet long enough that she nearly withdrew, before he said, without looking up, that he had known her for 2 years and had needed a forger's lie and his own grandmother's stubbornness to learn what should have been obvious to him from the very first week of their marriage, that she was the steadiest thing in his entire disordered inheritance, and he had spent 2 years treating her steadiness as a convenience rather than the rarest gift anyone had ever offered him without condition. She said nothing to that at first, because there was, she found, nothing safe to say, and the silence between them thickened with all the things 2 careful people had spent 2 years declining to speak, and outside the office window the wind had begun to rise in earnest, dragging the last of the season's leaves across the gravel with a sound like something restless turning over in its sleep. The sky gone the deep bruised color that Wren, of all women in that house, had learned to read best, the particular color that meant a true storm was coming and would not be argued out of arriving before morning. The wind found the office windows within the half hour, throwing rain against the old glass in gusts that made the candle flames shudder and lean, and Julian rose from behind the desk at last, crossing the room not with the easy authority he wore before the county, but with the slow, deliberate steps of a man testing ground he was no longer certain would hold him. Closing half the distance between them and stopping, and then, after a long moment in which the only sound was the storm working itself into earnest against the shutters, closing the rest of it, he said her name, only that, the single syllable he had spoken 1,000 times in 2 years of correct and careful marriage, and it came out of him now stripped of every ducal flatness she had learned to read as distance, as though the storm outside had reached in through the glass and peeled something away from his voice that he had worn so long he had perhaps forgotten it was armor rather than skin. He said that he had told himself, for 2 years, a great many careful reasons for the coldness he had shown her, and that he intended, before the night was finished, to say all of them aloud precisely so she could watch him discard every one. It was not, he said, because the marriage had been arranged rather than chosen. Since he had known men who chose their own wives and loved them considerably less than he had come, by slow and humiliating degrees, to depend upon her. It was not because he doubted her competence, since he had watched her correct his own steward's fraud with a private notebook and 2 years of patient diligence no one had asked her to keep, and everyone in this house had nonetheless quietly relied upon. It was not, he said, his voice dropping lower, even because he feared what loving her would cost him, though he had told himself that lie longest of all, because a man who had buried a father who loved no one well, and a mother who had loved too openly and been punished for it, had decided, somewhere in his own boyhood, that a guarded heart was a safer inheritance to leave his children than an open one. None of that, he said, was the truth. Or rather, all of it had been true, and none of it had been the reason. And the reason, the only one that had not worn thin under 2 years of his own scrutiny, was simpler and far more frightening to say aloud than any of the others, which was that he wanted her. Not the convenient duchess who solved his accounts and steadied his horses and asked nothing of him in return, but her. Entirely. In the particular unwitnessed hours when no ledger needed balancing and no ball required attending, and no one else in the world was watching either of them at all, wanted her in exactly the plain, unornamented way her father must have meant when he told her that steady hands don't ask to be seen, because he, Julian, had spent 2 years watching her hands go about their steady, unremarked work, and had only now understood that what he felt, watching them, was not gratitude, had never been merely gratitude, but something considerably less convenient and considerably more permanent. Wren did not move toward him. She had rehearsed, in some silent, unacknowledged corner of herself, this exact moment for longer than she would have admitted even to her own notebook, and now that it had arrived, delivered in his low, unraveled voice with the storm battering the shutters like something that wanted in, she found that 2 years of careful self-suppression did not simply dissolve, because the thing she had suppressed it for had finally been spoken. She said, in a voice steadier than she felt, that she had been called convenient by everyone in this house at one time or another, and had learned to answer to it, because the alternative, correcting them, cost more than she had been willing to spend, but that she would not now, having survived a forged letter and a trustee's inquiry, and 2 years of being useful without being seen, settle for a husband who loved her only once a storm and a scandal had frightened the truth out of him. She wanted to know, she said, and her voice did not shake, though something in her chest had gone very tight, whether he would have said any of this on an ordinary Tuesday, with no forger to expose and no grandmother to press him, or whether it had taken nearly losing her to teach him what he ought to have known from the very first week she drove her own gelding through his gates. Julian was quiet long enough that the wind filled 3 full breaths for him, and when he spoke again, it was without the low, urgent warmth of a moment before, replaced by something more careful, more exposed, a man laying down the last of his defenses because he had understood, in her question, that she was not asking him to comfort her, but to be honest with her. Which was, she thought even as she asked it, the harder and truer thing to ask of anyone. He said that he had noticed her, really noticed her, the night she drove herself to Ashcombe and arrived before him, that he had stood in the ballroom afterward, turning over the shape of a woman who did not wait to be rescued, and had spent every week since trying, and largely failing to find a decent reason to explain to himself why that particular fact should matter to him as much as it plainly did, and that the honest answer, which he had been too much a coward to give her until a forged letter forced his hand toward honesty of every kind at once, was that he had begun loving her somewhere in that unremarkable autumn. Quietly, the way she did everything, and had simply lacked the courage to say so before circumstance stripped him of any further excuse for silence. It was not, she noted, watching his face in the unsteady candlelight, a full answer to her question, and she told him so, gently, because she had decided some time ago that gentleness cost her nothing, and honesty, hers or his, was the only currency she now intended to deal in, and Julian, hearing the objection, did something she had never once seen him do in 2 years of marriage, which was to close the remaining distance between them entirely and take both her hands in his, gloves and all, her father's cracked leather ruff against his own bare palms, and say, plainly, without a duke's flatness anywhere left in his voice, that yes, he would have loved her on an ordinary Tuesday too, that he had, in fact, already been loving her on a great many ordinary Tuesdays before he found the nerve to say it, watching her in the stable yard at dawn when she believed no one troubled to look, and that the only difference the storm and the forger had made was to strip away his last excuse for keeping that love a private, cowardly, unspoken thing. Wren felt something in her chest give way then, not collapse, not the sort of tears a lesser woman in a lesser story might have shed as surrender, but a single clean release, the sensation of a held breath finally let go after 2 years of careful, deliberate holding, and she found, to her own quiet astonishment, that her eyes had filled, not from grief, but from the simple, unbearable relief of being, at last, entirely seen, and she did not turn her face away from him to hide it, because she understood, even as it happened, that this particular tear was not weakness surfacing, but truth finally reaching daylight after 2 years underground. Julian did not release her hands. He held them through the whole of it, through the single tear and the steadying breath that followed, with the same unhurried patience he had once praised in a good driving hand, and it was Wren, not Julian, who spoke next, saying that she would not give him an answer built only on the relief of the evening, that she had spent 2 years learning her own worth without his help, and would not now hand the whole of it back to him simply because he had finally said the words she had waited to hear, and Julian said that he did not want her surrender, only her honest answer, whenever she was ready to give it, and that he intended to spend however long it took proving, in ordinary daylight and not merely in storms, that the man who had failed to see her for 2 years had learned, finally and permanently, to look. She asked him, then, why, of every possible reason a man might give a woman for wanting her, he had settled at last on wanting her simply for the unwitnessed hours, when nothing required of her, and no one was watching either of them, and Julian said that it was the only reason he trusted anymore, because titles could be inherited, and fortunes could be arranged, and even affection, he had learned to his own shame, could be performed for an audience when performance was convenient, but no one performed devotion in an empty stable yard at dawn to an audience of 1 horse and a groom who wasn't looking, and it was there, watching her do the quiet, unrewarded work no one had asked her to do, that he had first understood what he actually felt, which was not admiration, not yet. He had told himself then, but recognition, and recognition, given time and honesty, had simply grown into something he no longer had any interest in denying. Wren said, after a silence long enough that the storm outside seemed to lean in and listen for her answer, that she supposed she was, then, prepared to give him one, and that her answer was yes, not because the forger had been caught, not because Augusta had ordered them both toward honesty with her usual terrifying efficiency, not because a ballroom full of strangers had finally decided to notice her, but because she wished it, plainly and entirely on her own account, and had wished it, if she was honest with herself, considerably longer than she had permitted herself to admit even to her own notebook. Julian's hand tightened around hers then, not the correction of a rider steadying a nervous horse, but something simpler and more human. A man holding on to the one thing in his disordered inheritance he had finally understood to be irreplaceable, and he said, in a voice that had entirely shed whatever remained of a duke's careful authority, that he was glad. Because he did not think he could have borne hearing any other answer, and outside the shuttered windows the storm reached what would prove to be its final furious pitch before beginning, by degrees too gradual to name a single moment, to exhaust itself against the old stone of a house that had stood through worse and would stand through this. They stayed in the estate office a long while past the point where either of them had anything further to say, her hand still inside his, neither of them troubling to release the other even once the conversation had worn itself down into the comfortable, wordless quiet of two people who had finally stopped performing for each other. And it was in that quiet, with the rain settling from fury into a steady patient fall against the glass, that Wren understood the storm had done what storms in her father's careful weather reading had always eventually done, which was to pass, leaving behind it an air washed clean enough that even old stone might for once feel like shelter rather than exile. The following months carried Alderley through a winter that the county would remember, in the retelling years afterward, chiefly for how thoroughly the estate's fortunes turned, though the turning had less to do with fortune than with a duchess finally permitted to do openly what she had always done in careful secret. Julian installed her, before the new year had properly begun, as acknowledged partner in the estate's breeding program. Her name entered alongside his own, in the studbook Reeve had once falsified, and the county's opinion of a duchess who understood horseflesh better than any steward Alderley had ever employed, an opinion that had spent 2 years curdling quietly into the word convenient, began, slowly and then with the particular speed of fashionable opinion changing its coat, to reverse itself entirely, until the very families who had once murmured about a duchess reduced to driving her own gig were writing, with careful humility, to ask whether the Duchess of Alderley might advise them on a mare's bloodline or a difficult yearling's training. Lady Antonia, whose cruelties had always drawn their force from an assumed permanence of household hierarchy, found her own position at Alderley quietly and irreversibly altered once it became clear that her brother's marriage was no longer a convenient arrangement to be managed, but a partnership to be respected, and though she never precisely apologized. In the particular way people of her temperament rarely do, she grew, over that winter, noticeably more careful in what she said within Wren's hearing, a caution Wren accepted without comment, because she had learned that some reformations arrive quietly and are better welcomed than interrogated. Cordelia Vane's fortunes fared considerably worse. The fuller shape of her involvement in Reeve's fraud, however carefully hedged against direct prosecution, traveled through the county's drawing rooms with the same efficient alchemy that had once turned Wren's driving gig into gossip, and by the following season Cordelia found her invitations thinning in the particular polite. Unremarked way society disposes of people it has decided to no longer entirely trust, her father's estate suddenly less charming to families who had previously overlooked its debts for the sake of her beauty and connections, and she removed, by spring, to a distant cousin's household in the north, from which correspondence rarely and never favorably reached Alderley again. It was in the following autumn, almost exactly a year to the week since a carriage had rattled away down the Lime Avenue without her, that the county gathered once more at Ashcombe, this time not for a ball but for the first running of what had become, within a single remarkable season, the district's most celebrated horse fair. An event that existed at all only because the Duchess of Alderley had proposed it the previous winter to a skeptical Lord Ashcombe as a means of drawing serious buyers and serious breeders to a county too long content with its own small closed circle, and had then spent the better part of a year alongside Augusta's considerable social weight and Julian's quiet, steady support, building it from a doubted notion into an actual gathering of consequence, one that drew breeders and buyers from 3 counties beyond their own, and put Alderley's carefully rebuilt breeding program before exactly the kind of audience that mattered. The fair had been, by every measure that mattered to the people who had once doubted it could succeed at all, a triumph. The Alderley stock-fetching prices that silenced even the skeptics who had murmured, the previous winter, that a duchess ought to leave such matters to men who understood them, and it was at the fair's closing dinner, held in Ashcombe's great hall beneath the same chandeliers that had lit the ball where Wren once arrived alone and unremarked, that Julian rose to address the assembled company. And the room, sensing something in the particular stillness with which he stood, quieted by degrees until even the clatter of Lord Ashcombe's excellent silver had gone entirely silent, the whole gathered crowd leaning almost imperceptibly forward the way a room leans when it understands, before it has quite been told that it is about to witness something it will repeat for years afterward. Julian said that he owed the room, and more particularly he owed his own wife, an apology he had been too proud and too slow to offer publicly until now, and that he wished to say plainly before every person gathered who had once whispered the word convenient, as though it were the whole of what his marriage contained, that they had been wrong, entirely and completely wrong, and that he had, for too long, allowed that wrongness to stand uncorrected, because correcting it would have required him to admit, in front of exactly this kind of company, how badly he himself had once failed to see what stood plainly in front of him. He said that the woman society had once dismissed as a horse breeder's daughter, fit only for practical use, possessed a steadiness of hand and heart that he had watched, over 2 remarkable years, hold an estate's accounts honest, a forged accusation to account, and an entire county's breeding fortunes upright, and that she had done every bit of it without once asking to be thanked, which he now understood to be not the absence of worth, but its rarest and truest form. He said that she was steady where lesser people were merely composed, generous where lesser people were merely polite, and honest in a world that had rewarded her for 2 years, chiefly for her silence. 3 virtues he numbered aloud with the deliberate cadence of a man who had rehearsed them not for eloquence, but because he meant every word to land precisely where it was aimed. And he said at the last, with his eyes fixed on his wife across the candlelit length of the great hall, in a way that made the whole room feel, for one suspended moment, as though they were the only 2 people present, that he hoped, whatever the county chose to remember of this evening, it would remember above all that the truest inheritance a house like Alderley could hope to pass forward was not its bloodlines or its acreage, but the kind of steadiness his wife had shown it, freely, long before anyone thought to ask for it, and that he intended their children, whenever they came, to grow up knowing precisely whose hands had truly held this family together when it mattered most. The applause that followed was not the polite, measured acknowledgement a room extends to a duke's expected gallantry. It rose instead in a genuine unguarded swell that caught even Julian by surprise, Augusta's own hands among the first and loudest, Lord Ashcombe rising fully to his feet, and even Antonia, watching from farther down the long table, bringing her own hands together with an expression that had, for the first time in 2 years, nothing calculating left in it at all. Wren did not weep at the tribute, though something in her chest tightened with the same clean release she had felt once before in a storm-lashed office, And she understood, watching the room's genuine, unrehearsed warmth wash toward her, that this was the thing her father had promised her long ago, without either of them quite knowing it would take this precise shape. That steady hands do not ask to be seen, and yet, given time enough, and one honest witness willing to say so aloud, are eventually seen anyway, more completely for having waited. Later that night, once the guests had gone, and the great house had settled into the particular hush that follows any gathering large enough to leave a room feeling larger once it empties, Julian found her again in a quiet corner of Ashcomb's garden, the autumn air gone crisp and clean the way air always does once a season's last storms have finally passed through it, and he took her hand. Not with any of the formal correctness of 2 years' careful marriage, but with the plain, unhurried certainty of a man who intended never again to let a convenient excuse stand between his hand and hers. And he said that he had one more question he had never properly asked her, a proper one this time, not forced from him by any forger's letter or any storm's urgency, and he asked whether she would choose him now, freely, on an entirely ordinary evening, with no crisis to excuse either of their honesty, not because a settlement bound them, not because an estate required an heir, not because a county now applauded rather than whispered, but simply because she wished it, exactly as she had once told him she did in the depths of that storm, and Wren, looking up at a sky finally scrubbed clear of cloud, the first hard stars of the season showing sharp and steady overhead, said yes, because I wish it, the same 4 words she had given him once before, offered now without any storm to explain them, freely and entirely her own, and Julian brought her gloved hand, her father's cracked and honest leather, to his lips and did not let it go, and neither of them spoke again for a long while, content simply to stand together in the clean-washed dark. The dawn that rose over Alderley the following morning arrived the way dawns do after the year's last true storm has finally spent itself, pale gold spreading first along the lime avenue where a carriage had once driven away without her, then across the frost-silvered paddocks where a stallion named Meridian still grazed exactly where he belonged. Then through the tall windows of the house itself, touching, in its slow patient climb, the small marbled notebook still kept in a drawer beside a duchess's bed, the same drawer that held a pair of driving gloves worn soft now in every place 2 devoted hands had ever gripped them. It had never been a story that required perfection to be worth the telling, only honesty, only the plain, unglamorous work of 2 careful people learning, by inches and storms and forged letters, and one unwitnessed dawn after another, to trust what steadiness had quietly built between them long before either had the courage to name it. And if the marriage that emerged from that long, slow reckoning was not without its ordinary difficulties still to come, its small disagreements over horses and household and the particular stubbornness 2 equally steady people inevitably bring to any shared life, it was, Wren thought, standing at her window with her husband's hand still warm in memory against her own. Not perfect and not easy, but simply and entirely shared, and that, she had learned at considerable cost and now believed with her whole steady heart, was more than enough.